What they also did is they created a narrative of ending poverty as meeting basic needs. And in my mind, this was a setback to the advances. So if you remember, basic needs was a concept that was introduced in the 1970s and early 80s. And that was therefore before a better understanding of poverty as being not only multidimensional, but understanding poverty as capability deprivation and as lack of freedom, as lack of human rights. And so the narrative of meeting basic needs was this sort of rather minimalist, materially based understanding of ending poverty, and also framed a policy agenda that actually kind of kept out of the table, kept out of the framework, all kinds of complex issues like economic transformation, environment, and all kinds of radical ideas. So now the question with the SDGs is, that I worked on this time, is what drove the setting and measuring of the SDGs, and to start with this suspicious frame of mind, where, as one of the contributors to this project says, measurement is never an innocent matter where, as it were, the facts speak for themselves. What is measured, who does the measuring, how data are collected, interpreted, and dispersed, how they are harnessed to decision-making and program implementation, and how the other measures and ways of collecting information are displaced. All these are contested matters because they are linked with a specific orientation of institutions and policies, the outcomes that they aspire to, and the forms of knowledge that they privilege. So, I must say that my problem with these effects of indicators dates back quite a long time. Back when I was actually working on the human development reports, and I think I speak for most of the colleagues who worked in the Human Development Report Office, we were always extremely frustrated that the HDI was better known than the concept of human development, right? And we kept saying human development is much larger than the HDI, much more complex than the HDI. But we could never somehow beat the power of numbers that communicated that Human Development Index, this combination of education, health, and income, not even standard of living, income, was human development. And so what's the difference between human development and social development, or social sector development, or education and health? No one could really explain. And so there was, so I wrote this paper a long time ago. Anyway, so let me go on to the SDGs. I'm going to be sharing with you some results of an international collaborative research project, a multidisciplinary research project that I led together with Desmond McNeil of University of Oslo, where we conducted a series of case studies on different themes, indicator sets in the SDGs, different themes in the SDG agenda. And so to trace an indicator for a target, for an objective, to see how adequate it was, how it came to be, and what effect it would have. And the whole thing is published in the Global Policy Journal, Volume 10, Number 1, and which was issued in February of this year. And it is all accessible online, freely accessible. So you are welcome to go to the website of that Global Policy Journal. You'll find it easily. And this includes these case studies, but we also looked at the shifting terrain of data, the new ecology of data, where we are finding that the data are no longer coming from the traditional sources of national statistical offices and UN agencies that create the international data series, but more and more data are coming from private sources, from big data. And in fact, we think that there is a data war going on, and that will intensify as there is increasing distrust of national statistical offices and less funding for national statistical offices, and increasing funding for these alternative data sources. And a good example of that is in the area of health, where Bill Gates has given $1 billion to Chris Barry to construct the Institute for Health Metrics in Washington. That has become the de facto global source of data on health. And now they have made an agreement with the WHO that they will provide the data to WHO. So they have basically replaced from the inside WHO as the officially sanctioned source for data on health. So there's something curious going on. Anyway, and then we also have interesting commentaries from different policy stakeholders. So people from UNDP, Friedrich Ebert Stiftung, but also negotiators for the SDGs, Paula Caballero from Colombia, who actually invented the term SDGs, and Enrique Ordaz, who is the co-chair of the Interagency and Expert Group on SDGs, that is the body of the Statistical Commission, who is also a director at the INEGI in Mexico. A former chief statistician of South Africa, and so on. And if you look at the titles of those papers, they are rather fascinating. They talk about things like the political thriller of data setting. Anyway, the basic conclusion of our studies is that there is a consistent slippage of ambition and concept between the goals and the indicators that were selected. And, so there was an innovative process for setting goals and targets in the SDGs. And for anybody who was at all involved, I think it was clear that this was something unprecedented, that in the United Nations, which is obviously a forum that is not known for democratic participation, but that is somewhat dominated by member states standing up and giving wooden speeches. The process for negotiating the SDGs was quite different. Because there was 3 years of intense negotiations, and it was quite. And they also set up a mechanism called the Open Working Group of the General Assembly, which was also unprecedented, in a sense that when negotiations. So just remember that the Agenda 2030 is something that is adopted by the General Assembly. So, well, how does something get adopted by the General Assembly? you have someone who writes a proposal and so it gets adopted, right? Well, in most cases, the tradition is that there is some backroom person who writes the draft, and then governments work through regional groups, like the Latin America group, the Asia group, the Western group, and so forth. And then they come to negotiate. And what they did is they broke all that up. They created something called the Open Working Group, which was made up of 24 member states only. But then since everybody wanted to be there, it became kind of like an open group entirely. And what was the consequence of that? It meant that, for example, traditional entrenched positions of the G77 weren't the driving force. What happens with these UN negotiations is that you get these sort of entrenched positions of these blocks that drive everything. And so you get no innovation, new ideas, and all of that was broken. It meant that smaller states had more voice. It meant that out-of-the-box thinking had more voice. They also opened up the proceedings to civil society. So civil society could actually make comments. The chairs of the OWG met every day with the civil society in the morning at 8 o'clock in the morning for an hour to hear what their concerns were. So I think there was a genuinely different kind of negotiation that went on. And that led to this thing called Agenda 2030, which was clearly much more progressive, ambitious, transformative than what the government negotiations would have, diplomatic negotiations among states would have created. And so people in civil society were very happy with the kind of things that were there. So the three key findings is that there was this innovative process, but there was this slippage of that ambition through the selection of indicators that narrowed down the meaning of those objectives. And then there was a kind of an elephant in the room, which was a changing landscape of data production that is outstripping the capacity of NSOs. So some of the most more ambitious and transformative elements of the agenda is that it has a much broader vision that addresses structural causes of poverty, inequality, environmental decline. The shift from MDGs to SDGs broadens the agenda, so the MDGs were driven by aid donors to focus on poverty. Developing countries pushed for industrialization and economic growth, and it's there. The environmentalists pushed for a very broad environmental agenda. Right? So this reflects the greater voice of the South governments and civil societies. And if you just look at the list of the SDGs and compare it with the MDGs, it has many things that the MDGs excluded, such as inequality, environment, and in certain areas, such as education, there's a broader agenda within that field emphasizing quality and equality, and not just achieving a certain number of years. And things like access to justice was included. And there's this thing called means of implementation and common but differentiated responsibilities, which was a principle that Global South governments pushed for, which was to recognize that countries with different levels of development had to have different levels of responsibilities in the global sphere. So, what do I mean by the fact that there was this slippage? Well, I'm going to spend the rest of my comments on explaining this by taking the indicator for inequality. So if you look at the Agenda 2030, you see that the idea of inclusion, of going to including the marginalized and the vulnerable, is very strong. And somehow most people think that is part of an agenda of inequality, reducing inequality. And the 2030 agenda has this rallying cry, leave no one behind. So at face value, you think that it has a very strong goal. There's a standalone goal, reduce inequality within and between countries. But when you get to the targets and indicators, it's a very weak agenda. There are 10 targets and 11 indicators. And the most noticeable thing is that when most of us think about inequality, we think first about income distribution, inequality in income distribution. There is no indicator or target for reducing income distribution or inequality. There is this target called progressively achieve and sustain income growth of the bottom 40% of the population at a rate higher than the national average. You could argue that it's a target that would in effect reduce inequality in terms of distribution. The indicator ends up being the same, but in effect, because that's all you have, there is really no indicator of inequality, and you could have this while actually increasing inequality. That's also possible. All the other targets and inequality indicators are on things like group-based discrimination, and the voice of developing countries in decision-making, things of that kind, which in principle as targets are very important and should be there. But when you get to the indicators, they're kind of like things that you can't really do very much with. So what's noticeable, and there's one indicator which I think is good, which is the labor share of income. So how did this come about? Well, the politics of it was that the contestation over ideas and the contestation over the important goals, over inequality, was a central issue in the negotiations of the 2030 agenda. And you know, I had a lot of fun going around talking to interviewing all kinds of people, you know, government negotiators, civil society groups, reading all kinds of documents that were provided as inputs into these negotiations. And it became clear to me that right from the beginning, inequality and this sort of idea of not just reducing averages, but getting to the marginalized and excluded had to be there. Because the MDGs were criticized for neglecting inequality and also for saying halve poverty. And people said, well, which half am I in? One, you know, that's going to be benefit or not. And therefore, the idea that the agenda wasn't going to be just about reducing averages, but about going to zero was important. And so there was a big question, therefore, was not about whether inequality was going to be part of the agenda, but how it was going to be reflected. So number one, was there going to be a standalone goal? And the argument for a standalone goal was that it was intrinsically important. Inequality as a social phenomenon has an intrinsic importance for social and political reasons, and that there were costs, social and political costs to extreme inequality. The arguments against a standalone goal was that it was redundant, because you could say, well, if you eliminate poverty, then that would be okay. Or if you say you reduce inequality, if you take care of the marginalized in education, then you take care of the inequality problem. So that was the nature of the controversy. And in the different processes, as many of you know, I mean, there were two processes. One was called the post-2015 process. That was organized by the UN Secretary General, which included all kinds of consultations. And in that process, there were global thematic consultations, and those global thematic consultations led by UNICEF and UN Women recommended a standalone goal on extreme inequality. Then there was a lot of lobbying by civil society, including academics. There was a letter signed by Joseph Stiglitz and 90 other leading academics saying there had to be a goal on inequality. There were a lot of technical debates on the concept of inequality and on the metrics. But what happened was that in this post-2015 process, a big part of it was this thing called high-level panel of eminent persons, led by David Cameron of the UK, and Prime Minister, the President of Liberia and President of Indonesia. And it is very well known that David Cameron was totally against the inequality goal. I mean, a very strong position on that. And it is also very clear that the dividing line was that the UK, most of the Western countries, most of the big donor, well, some of the big donors were not very keen on or were against the inequality agenda, standalone goal, or a robust debate about it. And they obviously prevailed in as much as the high-level panel report did not include a goal on inequality, on reducing inequality. But they introduced this idea of leaving no one behind. On the other hand, the open working group of the General Assembly, which was all the states. So remember, if you have all states, developing countries have much greater voice than in a sort of selected group. And there was a much more support for the standalone goal, particularly from what were the civil society groups that were represented through something called the major groups, and a number of delegates, including many from Latin America, who were champions. I don't know what's happened to this, but is there, you know, the bottom of the, yeah, I don't know why the bottom of the, no, the bottom of the thing doesn't show. Never mind. If you could just go back to the one that I was showing. Yes, this one. Yeah. Anyway. Yeah, this one. Yes. Okay. So this shows better. So now there was this agreement to have the standalone goal, but as I mentioned, the goal, the target in the indicator selected was the shared prosperity indicator of the World Bank. And when you think about it, it actually makes a great deal of difference what indicator you choose as to what social and political problem you are trying to get at. because inequality is a general term, and it could refer to all kinds of things. So basically, the lowest 40% income's growth rate, being better than the national average, focuses on the bottom of the distribution, and is essentially a poverty indicator, poverty reduction measure. The Gini coefficient, which for all its faults is the one that is most widely used in standard economic literature and in, policy documents and in all kinds of other things, looks at an overall distribution, but is most sensitive to shifts in the middle, right? Less on the top and the bottom. The Palmer index is actually the share of the top 10% over the share of the bottom 40%. And that is sensitive to changes in the top and bottom tails, right? So this Palmer index actually gained a lot of traction during the debates that I mentioned as actually the most appropriate measure for inequality reduction during the sort of consultations and the multiple debates that had. I mean, many of the discussions conducted at places like ODI and Center for Global Development and so forth tended to go for the top and bottom tails of the Palmer index. It depends on what you think the problem of distribution is, whether it's a concern with poverty or whether it's a concern with something to do with sort of this general distribution, or whether it's to do with the distance between the top and the bottom. Now, the thing is that in the debates that we have been having, particularly at the time in 2012, 2013, 2014, the concern was with extreme inequality. You remember the publication of Piketty's Capital. And you remember, that was all about the share of the top 1% and the share of the 0.1%. The tax evasion of the top 0.1% and so on, and the Panama Papers and the corporations behind all of that, right? And it had a lot to do with the nefarious political effects that corrodes democracy. That when you have this extreme inequality, you have the economic elite that is going to basically capture your democratic processes. And that's what's wrong with it. I mean, the thing about poverty is that from an ethical point of view, you can say that there is something fundamentally wrong with people living below a certain minimum because they are not able to lead a decent life, a dignified life. But with inequality, there is no threshold, right? There's no theory of inequality that says this is an unacceptable level of inequality. Societies differ with respect to the aversion to inequality, right? And so for economists, I think thinking about inequality is difficult because you can't kind of get beyond, well, here's a measure, let's use it. And economists, I think, disagree. I mean, I was rather surprised to read Angus Deaton saying there is no intrinsic problem with inequality, right? I mean, I don't know how many of us in this room agree with that statement, but presumably each of us has some notion of why we think inequality is problematic. And there are all kinds of sort of, arguments about Rawlsian approach, and, that those approaches tend to emphasize poverty as a reason why inequality is a problem. But recent debates, and Joe Stiglitz is clearly one of the most articulate economists on this topic, makes it clear that it's extreme inequality and the problem of the rich having too much wealth and economic resources and buying political power, that you have, that is the core problem of inequality in the 21st century, of today's capitalism. So, so the choice of measurement actually embeds your choice of the ethical concern that you have about what is wrong with inequality. It embeds certain attachment to theories, right? I mean, you know, economist theories about inequality are kind of all over the place, you know? So there's a kind of textbook economics, as, you know, Nancy Birdsall has this lovely paper that sort of talks about textbook economics that says constructive effects are, you know, it's a necessary part of development. It's also for incentive for hard work and talent. But then there are all these destructive effects, effects on economic growth, waste on human resources, these inefficient policy choices, and, you know, Joe Stiglitz is now very strong on this, reduces aggregate demand and leads to all kinds of instability from policies that the wrong kinds of policies to redress failing demand. So this is why the choice of measurement is not just a technocratic choice. It embeds all kinds of assumptions about values, social objectives, and economic theory. So what happened in the negotiation, this is where I found very interesting, actually, talking to some of the people who were in the room. I mean, I talked to some of the people who were chairing some of these sessions, and they said to me very blithely, oh, no, there was no controversy over inequality measurement in the OWG. Yes, Joe Stiglitz came and talked about the Palmer ratio, and so all that was much too technical, you know. No one could understand it. I mean, I can't understand what's so technical about the Palmer index. And yeah, you know, all of this, this discussion ended up being about measurement, but, you know, we just decided that it was just too technical. And then when it came to, so there's a process in the SDG framework where this political body, the General Assembly's Open Working Group, decides on the goals and the targets. And once that's decided, that was adopted in 2015, it goes to the Statistical Commission and this working group of the Statistical Commission called the IAEG. Well, you know, once they had decided, once it got to the technocrats, the statisticians, they couldn't do anything about it because, you know, there were all kinds of other proposals like Palmer Index and Gini, but that they didn't reflect the meaning of the target, which had already been written with the measurement embedded in it. So, I mean, you can imagine who strategically inserted this shared prosperity indicator into this framework. It somehow very cleverly got inserted into it. So, I mean, and this despite the fact there were all of these other choices, you know. So in Doyle and Stiglitz, you know, Michael Doyle, who used to be the Assistant Secretary General in the UN, who is a very prominent international relations scholar, proposed that there should be a target to reduce inequality. And this is not bad. Reduce income in extreme, it says extreme income inequalities in all countries such that the post-tax income of the top 10% is no more than the post-transfer income of the bottom 40%. And then it says by 2020, establish a public commission in every country that will assess and report on the effects of national inequalities. But this was kind of just discarded, and then in the statistical processes, there were multiple groups that proposed alternatives, but it was never displaced. So the conclusion in all of this is that this measurement tool reinterprets the targets and goals. I mean, basically, you have an indicator of shared prosperity, which is basically a poverty indicator, reinterpreting the meaning of reducing inequality within countries. And that embeds this theories, particular theories about what inequality is and what is wrong with inequality. That is poverty and not extreme inequality, not a problem of the rich. And but what is interesting is that in the processes that we have in global governance, the processes of UN negotiations over global goals and indicators, you are kind of playing with this, pretending that what is political is not political and technical, but what is technical is not political. And you're pretending that the negotiations over the target was not technical when it actually was, and refusing to listen to the technical arguments, and then in the technical discussion of the indicators, refusing to acknowledge that they were political considerations and going for better technical choices. So there are many other examples like this in the SDG framework. Sustainable consumption and production patterns, changing production and consumption patterns, I think is one of the most transformative goals that there is. But, you know, there were through these negotiations and compromises, you know, basically this is a North-South agenda. The South wants this because the South is saying that the Northern consumption patterns need to be reined in. There is always this assertion that production can be sustainable through technology choices. In education, SDGs were negotiated to include quality, equity, all of these important values in human development and capability approach, such as wider learning, including global citizenship, sustainability, and gender equality. But such ambition is diluted by the indicators. And, you know, you use like the ICT as a proxy for skills, provision of infrastructure as proxy for access to disabled, and so forth. The equal access to justice for all, that was another very hard-won battle to have included in the framework. But when it came to finding indicators, it boiled down to reporting crime. So this is just a sort of a set of examples that give you a sense of why there is this systematic sort of dumbing down of the transformative ambition of the global development framework. And so I've said all of this. I mean, I think that you know, the recognizing the political nature of indicators, I think is important for all of us who are concerned about human development capabilities, that embed all of these values that are qualitative and that are very difficult to measure, and to not be sort of taken in by the indicator set, and to remember also that the politics over development indicators continues, that it isn't over yet because the indicator sets are still being finalized, because many of the indicators were not finalized, and they're in these things called Tier 2 and Tier 3. And unfortunately, civil society that had been so mobilized in negotiating the goals have kind of, you know, let their efforts down. But a major point of this is to say that the site of contestation in the power struggles are actually over indicators, right? And the sites of power struggles are shifting in these international negotiations. And in the indicator world, you have this other bigger picture of the bigger problem of asymmetries of power, where the national statistical offices are very underfunded, very weak, nationally and internationally, and they're overtaken by this enthusiasm over big data. And big data has all kinds of problems because an awful lot of it is proprietary, private, no one knows for what purpose they're being collected, and the coverage, the representativeness, the use, in all of that, I think is not subject to public prioritization. So, and finally, I just want to finish by saying, the reason why I care about all of this is because it's not just sort of a matter of this policy choice or that policy choice, that these indicators are they're reinterpreting targets and goals, redefining concepts, and that is a powerful mechanism for framing global narratives. And there's a whole theory about the effect of framing as an exercise of hegemonic power, because powerful, strong institutions use framing to impose a certain narrative of what the problems of development are, what the solutions are, but most importantly, to keep out radical ideas, opposing ideas. And this is illustrated by keeping out the Palmer ratio, keeping out the problem of extreme inequality, keeping out the rich as a source of problem. So thank you.
Sakiko, thank you so much for this extraordinary conference. I was at the UN when the SDGs were negotiated, and it resonates a lot about my own experience, and the frustration we felt at different moments in the negotiation process. I also thought during all the conference about Michel Foucault's remark on the term statistic. It comes from the science of the state. And so statistic is there to govern, and govern in the sense of Napoleon, who started much of the process, which obviously makes us reflect in the way you have introduced and proposed the topic of this conference. So we have about, I think, 15 minutes for questions. Tlaloc, the god of rain, was not in our favor, but we will take 15 minutes for question, please. Yes, Flavio. Perhaps we will take 3 questions, so short question if possible.
Yeah, thank you so much. I find this very refreshing, subversively refreshing, I should say, yeah. There was a moment in your talk that it seems that you are more positive about SDGs in comparison to MDGs. But then at the very end, I'm in doubt. So I would like to pose this question very clearly to you. Do you have any grounds on which you are more positive about SDGs? And then at the very end, then MDGs, and then at the very end, I think when you're talking about power, I think there's one thing, we talk about agency and autonomy, but we are talking about agency and autonomy of the poor. When we are talking about power, we are adding a structural element that particularly we don't have any, tools in order to handle it. So what would you suggest? It seems you did not like this 1% Piketty-like approach to power. What suggestion would you have? Or you talk about hegemonic power here. So, but something more concrete, something more tangible in order to handle power. Thank you.
Yes, this is quite a consequent question. Perhaps you want to... yes.
Yeah, very simply. Yeah, well, you know, one of the pleasures of being on the faculty of the new school is you're sort of encouraged to be subversive. such a pleasure after working at an international organization. Even though I must say, when I think that when I was there, which was I left in 2004, things were much more apolitical, I think, and the Human Development Report was quite immune to all kinds of political pressures, but one can be even more than free and be actively subversive. But anyway, on the MDGs and SDGs, yes, I'm certainly more positive on the SDGs than MDGs because I think it's a more sensible agenda. I mean, it reflects much more of the agenda that I personally, you know, promote and care about. It is broader. It goes beyond poverty, as you know. I mean, I think this idea of, if you think about the MDGs, it really was so focused on poverty. It's very tricky because for those of us who have worked on human development, it seems wonderful, but actually, it's not, because it is a misrepresentation of human development. And I remember that, you know, in 1990, when I was not involved then, but when Amartya Sen and Mahbub Haq and Inga Kao was there, other people started the Human Development Report. They were very careful to talk about human development. It was a development report, not a poverty report. And the idea of MDGs defining development as meeting basic needs, it actually sets back everything we had learned over the decades of development experience since the 1950s, when we understood that poor countries needed to expand economic resources in order to meet human needs, right? And that there had to be a process of economic transformation, but that wasn't going to be enough, that it had to be for human ends, that it wasn't, that the process of development was this complex thing. And so it's like a real throwback that kind of suppressed all of the thinking of the 1950s, 60s, 70s that understood, you know, the process of economic transformation as also having this kind of a political component of global economic structures. And all of that was kind of the need for a developmental state. You know, and those of us who are concerned with human development capabilities, think about human development capabilities in the context of all of that other development thinking, you know, as defining the ultimate goals that we should not forget about. But it was as if the MDG agenda tried to obliterate all of the economic challenges, and that because the MDGs were so powerful as a narrative, and this is the reason why the donor community loved it, because for the donor community, it was a very simple narrative that conveyed to the people of the developed world that they had to care about global poverty because we were a global society, and this was our obligation. And that's absolutely perfectly fine. But the discarding of the rest of the challenges of development is very problematic, right? And and this is precisely the political negotiation that took place in the formulation of the SDGs. I mean, a lot of people think that somehow the SDGs came out of the MDGs. They didn't. I mean, the SDG, the MDG, post-2015 MDG process ended up with this David Cameron report, which was very narrowly focused on what I would call MDG+. And the SDG process was government-led and had much more voice of the Global South and civil society, and had these other elements in it, so this broader elements. But it was also the big criticism of the SDGs as having this gigantic agenda is precisely why I think it's actually a good thing. Because for the very reason that this simplification of development as the 8 development goals was kind of this reductionist simplification ad absurdum, the SDGs tell the story as it is, you know. Sorry, it is about access to justice. It is about environment. It is about the earth, the land, the ecosystem limits. It is about industrialization. And I think that because it's not a one-size-fits-all, it's because you can't tell a single simple story with it, I think it's fine. I mean, SDGs is a kind of global consensus on important things in the world that is not so easily translatable into this one-size-fits-all recipe that only donors want. I don't think anybody else wants a one-size-fits-all. I think it's the donors that want it. And on the power, I don't know why you think I gave the impression that I was not very in favor of the 1% Piketty line to power. I mean, I think that's certainly a very important way of understanding the distribution of economic power in the world today. There are many other kinds of power. I think what's interesting in understanding power and politics in the negotiation of a development agenda is that we understand that the power of ideas and the power of authority, of expertise, of bureaucratic authority and things of that kind.
Thank you. Another question? Otra pregunta?
So I'm wondering if you can, excellent presentation by the way, if you can speak a little bit to the dichotomy between inequality and inequity, which I think that may have a little to do with why Deaton said what he said.
What?
Deaton said what he said, Angus Deaton. Because it seems like inequality is inherent almost to the human condition, right? Like if I play a basketball game with Michael Jordan, there's no way that it would be, we would have to create some sort of, fairness around maybe I can start with like 20 plus points and then we can finish the game. But so can you speak a little bit to this dichotomy and whether or not this is informing this sort of international debates?
Yeah, I mean, I think this is precisely the reason why economists need to do a lot of work on inequality, right? Because it's not this one thing, it's just so many different things. Oh, yeah, we need, economists need to do a lot of work on inequality because it's, there are so many different dimensions to it. And, and obviously in the policy application, equity is something that we have to care about, not the intrinsic inequality. And and I think we're very sort of blind to, we seem to be just refusing to acknowledge the need to take into account inequality. For example, in international decision making, WTO negotiations. So many people have pointed out that WTO rules do not create a level playing field. They pretend to create a level playing field by pitting Ismail against Michael Jordan. And Harjun Chang always talks about this wonderful boxing match thing. The World Boxing Championships actually, has all of these leagues, featherweight or light, heavyweight. I have no idea. But I actually looked it up. And indeed, it's a matter of 2 kilograms, which league you're in. So, if they care so much about your a 2 kilogram difference in weight as to what would be a fair competition amongst athletes, then to totally ignore the capacity of Malawi compared with the United States in negotiating, or even implementing WTO rules is not a level playing field, right? Obviously. But then I think that so I wonder, however, whether there is something called inequality that is an absolute. I haven't really thought this through. But if you think in terms of capabilities, how would you think about capabilities and inequality in that sense, right? You have to redefine. If you think about inequalities in the capability space, how would that always be sort of like a concept of inequity as opposed to absolute inequality? I don't know.
Thank you so much. I think the space we had for question is shrinking very fast. So a super short question perhaps, and if nobody can, no short question, then we will have standing ovation or applause at least to Sakiko. Thank you so much.
Ok, buenas noches a todos. Gracias por haber aguantado la lluvia de verano de Puebla. Ya saben un poquito cómo son nuestros veranos por aquí. Les comento, para los que van a venir a la cena formal, tenemos un autobús esperando por ustedes del otro lado del tope, adentro del campus. Entonces, van a ir, pueden ver a los chicos que traen sombrillas para apoyarlos a caminar, cruzar. Ya no está lloviendo prácticamente, ya está básicamente desinundado la zona. Entonces, por favor, vayan avanzando y los vemos ahí en la cena. Espero que la disfruten. Gracias.